That's just my dad. He's retired from something in the service. I don't really know the details. My daughter told her fiancé's family, waving toward a photograph on my mantle like it was a piece of decor rather than a record of the hardest years of my life. I was in the next room and heard every word, and I stood there for a moment with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, absorbing the strange experience of hearing your own daughter admit, out loud, that she'd never actually asked. My name is Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Reilly, United States Marine Corps, retired. I was 62 years old the day I heard my daughter describe 26 years of service as something in the service. I don't really know the details. And I set my coffee down, walked back into the living room, and said absolutely nothing, because that particular truth wasn't mine to force into a conversation. It would find its own way out eventually. It usually does. I need to explain how a father and daughter get to a place where this much distance exists around something this significant. I enlisted in the Marine Corps at 19, right out of high school, and spent the next 26 years of my life in service, deploying multiple times, including 2 combat tours that I don't discuss in detail with most people. Not because it's classified, but because some experiences simply don't translate well into casual conversation, and I've never wanted to burden my family with the specifics of things they'd only find upsetting to hear. I earned some decorations along the way, including a Bronze Star with Valor device from an incident during my second deployment that I still, to this day, don't fully believe I deserve recognition for, given how many people around me that day did far more than I did and never came home to receive anything at all. That's not false modesty. It's simply how most of the men and women I served with tend to feel about medals. You did your job, other people didn't come home. The math never quite settles into something you can be simply proud of.
I remember the day the award was formally presented, a small ceremony back at base. My commanding officer at the time reading the citation aloud in that careful, formal military cadence reserved for these moments. I stood there in my dress uniform, feeling almost like an imposter, thinking about the 2 Marines from my squad who didn't make it home from that same operation, wondering what right I had to stand there receiving anything while their families received something entirely different. I've carried that feeling, quietly, for over 2 decades now. It's part of why I never brought the subject up at home, not out of secrecy, but because pride was never really the emotion attached to it for me. My daughter, Emily, was born when I was 34, partway through my career, which means she grew up with deployments as a fact of childhood rather than something dramatic or unusual. Her mother, Diane, and I divorced when Emily was 10, partly, I'll be honest, because the strain of military family life had worn at our marriage in ways neither of us fully anticipated when we were young and in love. Emily lived primarily with Diane after that, and I saw her on the custody arrangements we managed around my deployment schedule, which meant some years significant stretches where I simply wasn't present in her daily life at all. I retired from the Corps 14 years ago when Emily was 20. By then, the pattern of our relationship had mostly settled into something functional, but not especially deep. We talked on birthdays and holidays. I attended a college graduation. I walked her partway into adulthood from a slight distance, present but not fully woven into the daily texture of a life the way I might have been in a different kind of career. I never sat her down and explained my service in detail, partly because, as I said, some of it isn't easy to talk about, partly because I genuinely believed for years that she simply wasn't that curious, and I didn't want to force a conversation onto a daughter who seemed content with the surface-level version of her father. I kept my medals in a small case in a closet, not hidden exactly, just not displayed, the way plenty of veterans I know handle their own service, quietly, without ceremony, tucked into ordinary life rather than framed on a wall.
Emily met her fiancé, Marcus, about 3 years ago. Marcus is an active-duty Marine himself, a captain, still early enough in his career that the weight of command hadn't fully settled on him the way it eventually does. I liked him immediately when I met him. He was sharp, respectful, clearly devoted to Emily, and I felt, watching them together, the particular relief a father feels seeing his daughter genuinely well cared for. What I noticed, gradually over the following months, was that Emily still hadn't really explained my service history to him in any real detail. When Marcus asked, early on, what I'd done in the Marines, Emily gave him the same vague answer she'd apparently absorbed from years of never fully asking herself. Something about me having done some deployments and being retired now, the kind of description that could apply to almost anyone who'd worn the uniform for any length of time. I didn't correct this. I told myself, again, that it wasn't really my place to insert myself into how my daughter chose to describe me, especially to a man she was planning to marry. I figured if Marcus was curious enough, he'd ask me directly eventually, and I'd answer honestly if he did. He never quite did, not in any deep way in those early years. Our conversations stayed pleasant but surface level. Weather, sports, occasionally something about his own career trajectory, the kind of comfortable small talk that never quite opens into anything more substantial. I don't fault him for this. Plenty of younger service members, especially those still building their own careers, don't necessarily think to interrogate an older veteran's history unless something specifically prompts it. The moment that finally prompted it happened almost by accident, at an engagement dinner Marcus's parents hosted about 4 months ago. Marcus had invited his commanding officer, a full colonel named Whitfield, along with several other Marines from his unit, a gesture of including his professional community in a significant personal milestone.
I'd brought, at Emily's request, a few old photographs for a small display table her mother had set up, family pictures spanning Emily's childhood. Among them, almost as an afterthought, Emily had included one photograph from my own service days, a formal portrait in dress blues that Diane had kept all these years, one I honestly hadn't seen in over a decade myself. Colonel Whitfield was making his way through the photo table with the polite, unhurried attention senior officers often develop over careers spent at countless similar functions, when he stopped at that particular photograph. I watched him lean in slightly, study it for a long moment, then turn to find me across the room with an expression that had shifted from polite social interest into something considerably more focused. He crossed the room directly, extended his hand, and asked with unmistakable certainty in his voice whether I was Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Reilly. I confirmed that I was. What followed was a conversation that visibly rearranged the evening for several people in that room, particularly Marcus, who I watched go very still nearby, clearly processing something in real time. Colonel Whitfield, it turned out, had served as a young lieutenant under an officer who had, decades earlier, personally briefed his entire platoon on the incident that eventually earned me my Bronze Star, using it, as apparently happens sometimes in professional military education, as a case study in decision-making under extreme pressure. He'd known my name for years, he told me, as an example studied in training, without ever having any reason to connect that name to an actual living person he might one day meet at his own captain's engagement dinner.
Other guests began to notice the shift in the room, conversations quieting as people picked up on the fact that something significant was happening near the photo table. A couple of the younger Marines Marcus had invited drifted closer, curious, and I found myself, somewhat reluctantly, answering a few careful questions about a deployment I hadn't discussed in this much detail with anyone outside my own family in years. Marcus stood there listening to his commanding officer describe in specific and clearly well-informed detail an action I myself rarely discussed even in the vaguest terms, and I watched my future son-in-law's understanding of me shift permanently in the space of about 4 minutes. The dinner continued around us, but Marcus found me afterward, once the group had thinned out, and asked quietly why he'd never heard any of this from Emily, or from me directly, in 3 years of dating her daughter. I gave him the honest answer. I told him that some of what happened on that deployment wasn't something I discussed easily, that the Bronze Star represented one of the worst days of my life dressed up as an accomplishment, and that I'd never pushed the story onto anyone who hadn't specifically asked. I told him too that I suspected Emily's vague description of my career wasn't dismissiveness so much as genuine unfamiliarity, the natural result of a father and daughter who'd spent years living slightly apart from each other's daily lives. Marcus was quiet for a while, then told me something that stuck with me. He said that in his own limited time in command, he'd already learned that the Marines who talked least about their hardest moments were usually the ones who'd actually lived through something worth respecting, and that Emily's vague description, in hindsight, should have been his own signal to ask better questions rather than accept the easy version. He also admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that he'd always assumed there was more to my story, given the way older Marines occasionally treated me with a specific kind of deference at events he'd invited me to over the years. Small nods and handshakes he'd chalked up to general military courtesy rather than genuine recognition.
Emily found out the fuller story that same night, from Marcus rather than from me, and she called me 2 days later sounding genuinely shaken. Not upset with me exactly, but unsettled by her own realization of how little she'd actually asked her own father about the most significant chapter of his adult life. She admitted, honestly, that some of it had felt easier not to know. That, as a child of deployments and divorce, she'd built a kind of protective vagueness around my service, treating it as background rather than substance, because looking at it directly might have meant confronting how much it had actually shaped and cost our relationship. We had a longer conversation after that, one of the more honest ones we'd had in years. I told her some things I hadn't told her before. Not everything, some of it I still don't discuss with anyone, but enough that she left that conversation with a fuller, truer picture of who her father actually was, beyond the vague, comfortable outline she'd carried for most of her adult life. She asked me at one point why I'd kept the photograph at all if I never talked about what it represented, and I told her the truth. That Diane had kept it all those years, not me, and that seeing it again on that display table had been as strange for me as it apparently was for everyone else in that room. She told me near the end of that call that she wished she'd asked sooner, and I told her what I've come to believe is true for a lot of families like ours, that the asking usually has to go both ways, that I'd spent just as many years waiting to be asked as she'd spent not knowing there was anything worth asking about. Emily and Marcus got married 2 months ago. During his toast, Marcus mentioned, briefly but sincerely, that he'd married into a family with a legacy of quiet service he was still learning to fully appreciate, and Colonel Whitfield, seated near the front, raised his glass slightly toward me, in a small, private acknowledgement that meant more to me than I expected it to. I don't know that Emily and I have fully closed every gap built up over years of deployments and distance and divorce, but something did shift permanently that night at the engagement dinner. And I've noticed, since then, small differences in how she talks about me. Less vague, more specific. An actual daughter describing an actual father, rather than a comfortable placeholder she'd never quite gotten around to examining. If you've ever been reduced to a vague, comfortable outline by people who never thought to ask deeper, even people who love you, I hope you hear this. Some truths don't need to be forced into the open. They wait patiently, the way mine did, tucked into an old photograph on a display table, ready to be recognized by exactly the right person at exactly the right moment, whenever that moment finally decides to arrive. And sometimes, all it takes is one person in the room who actually knows what to look for.